Now let's take a look at some of the differences in brain structure and brain connectivity, brain activity that are seen in schizophrenia. So these just a variety of different types of brain anomalies. One thing that's definitely seen is that there's a reduction in the amount of gray matter. This sometimes results in larger ventricles. Now, larger ventricles are a symptom of just having a reduction in brain tissue, in particular the gray matter. It's just as there's less brain tissue, the size of the ventricles gets enlarged. So as we look down here at this picture down here, we're looking at identical twins who are discordant for schizophrenia. The one on the left here has schizophrenia, and the one on the right does not have schizophrenia. And so we're just doing this very simple comparison in this one group of twins just to kind of get an idea what this looks like. In the individual without schizophrenia, we can see that the ventricles are about this size at this point in the brain. But in their identical twin with schizophrenia, the ventricles are substantially enlarged. And again, that's just a sign that there's a reduction in brain tissue. Another thing that's seen is something called hypofrontality. So hypofrontality, the frontal lobe of the brain is less active than normal or than typical. It's interesting because here we see a reduction in dopamine activity. Now this at first is going to seem a little bit contradictory because what is the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia is that there's too much dopamine. And so here we're seeing that one of the greatest drivers of symptoms is reduced dopamine activity here in the frontal lobe. So it's just one of those reminders that what's happening in one part of the brain or in one set of synapses can be totally different in another part of the brain. And so yes, in general, in many areas of the brain, there is a heightened activity of dopamine in individuals with schizophrenia. But the frontal lobe of the brain actually does show a reduction in dopamine activity. And we also know that damage to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex can cause symptoms seen in schizophrenia, including the flat affect, withdrawal, and the cognitive impairments. And so there's a lot of research correlating reduced activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex with symptoms that are consistent with schizophrenia, and then improvement in those symptoms when activity there is increased. Now let's also take a look here at the size of the ventricle as a proportion to the size of the brain. So earlier we looked at just one set of individual twins. Now we're going to look at the group averages. And so for the control individuals in a particular study looking at the size of the ventricles, the average ventricle to brain ratio was down here. And in individuals with schizophrenia, we can see that the average is about twice as high. Is there overlap between the two? Absolutely. So you do not see the enlarged ventricles in every individual. It is a group average that's higher, but we can certainly see that there are several individuals that have schizophrenia whose ventricles are pretty similar to those individuals who do not have schizophrenia. So it's a good reminder that we're looking at differences in group averages, and that means we cannot make predictions about an individual necessarily. Now looking at the hypofrontality issue, we can see that when individuals who do not have schizophrenia are engaged in a task that requires use of the frontal lobe, we see high levels of activity here in the frontal lobe, both left and right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex especially, but in general the prefrontal cortex is showing lots of activity, right? So here's in particular is this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And in individuals with schizophrenia, oh my gosh, much reduced activity here, right? And so that is one of the characteristics of schizophrenia is that hypofrontality, that reduction in brain activity. Now you may be wondering, what is the Wisconsin card sorting task and why does it use the prefrontal cortex? We'll take a look at that, and we'll make a note right now that the hypofrontality seems to be a function of disrupted communication between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. So it's not just looking at one area in isolation, but hey, how do these different parts of the brain communicate together and influence each other? And here we're seeing that the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex have major connections between each other, and they're going to influence each other quite a bit. And those connections seem to be reduced in individuals with schizophrenia. So let's take a look at the Wisconsin card sorting test. So here we're seeing that they're matching on the shape, not color. Not quantity. And so that's going to work for a while. At that point, the task becomes pretty easy. But then at a later point, the rule will change and it will no longer be requiring matching by shape. And now you can see that the rule has changed and they're matching by quantity. And that switching of the rule midstream is what requires the prefrontal cortex. Now, hallucinations are part of the symptoms of schizophrenia, and they are associated with activity in their respective sensory area. So auditory hallucinations are going to involve activity in areas of the brain that are normally involved in language. Not surprising, right? Visual areas will become active during visual hallucinations. And so we can see here that a lot of the brain areas that are activated during an active hallucination period correspond to those areas that would be processing vision as well as sound. Now, this is consistent with the types of brain activity seen in everybody when we are speaking to ourselves or imagining things, so our inner speech. And any type of imagined visual scene is going to activate these areas in individuals without schizophrenia as well. So what's going on seems to be that these areas of the brain are being activated in a way that is consistent with just how everybody, with schizophrenia or without, activates these areas when we're sort of having that internal dialogue with ourselves or just sort of daydreaming and having that free flow of thought and experiences. The difference is then that in the case of schizophrenia, these experiences don't get properly attributed to oneself, perhaps, and that's one of the thoughts behind what's going on in schizophrenia. Now, when we look at those connections, those really critical connections between different brain areas, we see that there are reductions in the amount of white matter. So white matter, axons, right? So there are fewer connections between different areas. And we already looked at the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex is an area that's normally very richly connected with a lot of back and forth, and that those connections are diminished in individuals with schizophrenia. So you would normally see coordination between the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex during a working memory task, as the hippocampus activates the prefrontal cortex and vice versa to keep information in working memory. Loss of synchronization in the prefrontal cortex seems to be associated with both positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. With positive symptoms, we're seeing enhanced synchrony within a single area. So while in general there are fewer connections between areas like the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, in individuals with positive symptoms within a given area, say the occipital lobe, there's enhanced synchrony of neural activity there, and that corresponds, for example, to visual hallucinations. And when there's enhanced synchrony in the auditory cortex, that corresponds to the auditory hallucinations. Another characteristic of schizophrenia is that there's a reduced ability to suppress the processing of environmental sounds, and this is called auditory gating. And so it's a common phenomenon. If we hear two clicks that are very close together, so two in a single second, so maybe more like this, we tend to have a larger brain reaction to the first click than to the second. And this is what's called a P50. It's happening 50 milliseconds after the presence of that click or that sound. And so you can see here in a control individual, the first click gets a big reaction through the EEG signal, and the second click gets a much, much diminished reaction through the EEG signal. In individuals with schizophrenia, hey, look, that second click gets just the same size reaction as the first one. What's interesting, this type of auditory gating, that reduction in the reaction to the second click, improves after a few drug treatments that improve the symptoms of schizophrenia. So after several drug treatments that are effective in decreasing the symptoms of schizophrenia, we can see that has been a reduction in that reaction to the second stimulus. So auditory gating improves with successful treatment with antipsychotics. Another interesting connection with auditory gating is nicotine. Nicotine seems to normalize the auditory gating and improves the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, so the low affect, the withdrawal. And it's interesting, anecdotally, 80% of schizophrenia patients smoke. In addition, the gene for the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor seems to be implicated in schizophrenia. So a lot of possible self-treatment with nicotine in the case of schizophrenia.